It's 2 days after the national championship, but we are already moving on to next season, the 2026 way too early top 25. And just to quickly address a few things, yes, there are still players in the transfer portal. We're doing our absolute best. We've gone through all of the classes so far and really figured out who we think the top 25 teams are going to be. There's a few teams that we have in our just missed, and even a couple who made the poll that you might not even have on your radar yet. And from other videos that I've watched, other college football creators haven't really looked and found any of these teams either. So I do think we've probably done a good bit of research to find some really, really good teams to throw in here. And just overall, a lot of this stuff is going to change around springtime. Once everybody has kind of found their new homes in the transfer portal, we'll get a much better idea of who's really going to be good. This is really just for fun. But overall, I think we know a decent a bit about some of these teams, especially regarding the quarterback position, somewhat regarding returning production. There's still NFL draft decisions to be made, that kind of a thing. But let's go ahead and take a look at some of the teams who just missed our poll. And first up is going to be Penn State. Now, that might surprise a few people, but I think the only reason Penn State is really getting ranked in a lot of people's way too early polls is the fact that they have the name brand of Penn State. When it really comes down to it, this Penn State team, yes, they've made a few transfer additions that weren't from Iowa State, but it's basically just Iowa State from last season. And I think if you put the Iowa State logo on this roster, they probably wouldn't be ranked either. I think they're close, obviously, because we have them in our just missed, but I don't necessarily think that this team, even though it's really solid, I like Rocco Becht. And I think that Matt Campbell's a good head coach. They can figure things out, but I'm not 100% sure that this is legitimately a top 25 team for next season.
For Utah, the big story with the Utes is that longtime head coach has departed to Michigan after stepping away from the program. And so initially, a lot of people thought he was just going to retire, but he also took with him a bunch of the coordinators and some of their key players, such as cornerback Smith Snowden, offensive tackle Spencer Fano was also out at Utah. Just a lot of really big time players that helped Utah have a successful season last year. But they did manage to keep some people that are key to this offense in particular. Those being Devin Dampier and Wayshawn Parker, the quarterback and the running back for this team. So, first year head coach Morgan Scaley's got his work cut out for him to kind of rebuild this program a little bit after that mass exodus. But Utah definitely can still be competitive going into next year. We'll just have to see how the rest of the transfer portal shakes out for them. And then Auburn, the big story for Auburn is that Byron Brown is now going to be their starting quarterback. And I think that is a massive addition for them because the quarterback position has kind of been what has held Auburn back the last couple seasons from really returning to a super competitive role in the SEC. Obviously, they did have some big departures in the wide receiver room. And overall, Auburn, even with the wealth of talent they've had the past couple of years, still hasn't been able to get over the hump. But I do think this is another step in the right direction for the Tigers.
Our next team is going to be California. This one's probably going to surprise a lot of people, but they have their young quarterback, who I'm not even going to try and pronounce his name. He is returning, as well as the number 13 transfer portal class. They went 7-5 in the regular season. The ACC isn't particularly tough, especially once we find out what the schedule looks like for Cal. That'll tell us a little bit more about just how good this team can do. But really, there's a lot of young talent on this team, and I think they're pretty underrated going into next season. And now, probably our most controversial pick. Last year, we did not buy onto the UCLA hype whatsoever. A lot of people were putting them in or around their way too early polls, preseason polls, thinking Nico was going to have a great season there and turn the program around. We didn't buy any of it. We were right about that. I'm not necessarily confident in this pick to put UCLA in the just missed. They're basically like, if we were ranking these teams, they would be the number 30. And honestly, it's kind of just a shot in the dark. that Nico does have a better season this time around. They had a solid transfer portal class, really just bringing in guys from bigger programs who didn't have as much playing time. They brought in a decent amount of players from James Madison. That's another thing. Not necessarily having played such a high level of competition in the regular season, but they looked good against Oregon. If these guys can all kind of gel around this new head coach from James Madison, then I do think that UCLA could potentially end up being a fringe top 25 team this year.
At number 25, we're going to have Kentucky, which is our first team that I think a lot of people have flying under the radar. Their transfer portal class is actually very solid going into next season. Big story getting some offensive lineman additions, the biggest one being Tegra Tespoa from Ohio State. But overall, I do think Kentucky, after a pretty disappointing season last year, can start to right some wrongs. I'm not saying they're going to quite get to Texas Tech level of sort of rebuilding in one season using the transfer portal. But I do think this Wildcats team has a lot of potential. We even saw it this year with Mississippi State, who has been historically pretty bad the last few years in the SEC, have a bit of a resurgence and be very competitive. And I do think Kentucky has the ability to do that same thing this year with this strong transfer portal class that they have bringing in.
Now, number 24 also going to shock some people. Oklahoma State has been horrible the last two seasons, and this would be an incredible turnaround. But really, I mean, it's kind of like having North Texas from last season. Bringing in their head coach, Drew Mestemaker, I think is a very solid quarterback. The real question is, can these guys adapt to Big 12 play? And we saw with Oklahoma State's roster from last season, near the end of the season, they were starting to get close to being able to win some games. When you throw on the fact that they got one of the top available quarterbacks in the transfer portal, as well as one of the top classes, albeit largely due to the fact that it was just a very large class. The same thing is they have a lot of volume from these players, lots of depth. It increases the competition. You're going to find some really solid players, I think. It really reminds me of Virginia from last season, which conveniently same kind of thing with the North Texas quarterback transferring in, but I do think that Oklahoma has a lot of potential, or Oklahoma State has a lot of potential for next season. And with their schedule, they could really actually make a run towards the Big 12 championship if things go their way. Now, 23 is Virginia Tech. They got James Franklin and they got a lot of Penn State's team from last year. And this is another team completely turning it around. 3-9 last season. And I do think that they're going to be very solid next year. I mean, I like Ethan Grunkenmeyer. I think that, he got a little bit too much hate at Penn State. And really, I just think that Penn State team got unlucky. They got on a really bad streak. Their head coach got fired, and things kind of just went downhill. I feel like moving on to Virginia Tech, kind of getting a new start. Really, Penn State could have been a top 25 team last year. I think they could have beaten some of the top 25 teams by the end of the season. They just didn't deserve to be ranked because of what they did earlier on. I feel like Virginia Tech definitely has potential to be a top 25 team, and we had to throw them in here at number 23.
These next two teams are some familiar faces and just dominant programs, but the big story for both of them is how much they're losing and how young their teams are going to be. Starting off at number 22 with Alabama, you're losing your starting quarterback in Ty Simpson. You're losing a good amount of your offensive line, including Caden Proctor, who was an absolute stud this year. Wide receiver, tight end, running back, just losing so much of that offense that was hit or miss at times, but still very good. And then defensively, also a lot of big losses, including Deontay Lawson and LT Overton. Now, Alabama and Kalen DeBoer could easily rebuild this team very quickly with the wealth of talent they have. However, just because we don't know what the quarterback situation is going to be, considering it'll be a battle between Austin Mack and Keelan Russell, and just the amount of players and talent they need to replace, considering how this past season ended, even though they did get that comeback and dominant win over Oklahoma, I'm not quite ready to have Alabama any higher than around the 20s, almost borderline out of the top 25. But I still have a lot of faith in Kalen DeBoer to rebuild this Alabama team, and they'll still be a force to be reckoned with going into next year. And then at number 21, we have Michigan. Now, I'll be honest, I think Michigan definitely has the potential to be a lot higher than 21. But once again, it's just a matter of we haven't seen enough from them yet, and they have just a ton of new players coming in with the new addition of their head coach from Utah. With that brings so many players from Utah that can absolutely bolster his team, particularly on the defensive side. But also, Bryce Underwood's going to have probably his best receivers of his career, considering it's only been 2 years. But getting Jamie French Jr. from Texas, as well as getting Salisi Moa from Utah, he's going to have a wealth of weapons to help him grow in year two. And I do think, considering that Devin Dampier was the quarterback at Utah last year and has some similar tendencies to Bryce Underwood, I do think that he can be fully unlocked with this new coaching regime. But it's just going to be a matter of, can that happen this year, or is it going to happen next year or even the year after that? So Michigan, just by a product of we don't know enough about what is going to happen with all these new players, we really can't rank them any higher than 21, but we could easily see them jump up if things start to go in the right direction.
Yeah, my biggest problem with Michigan is honestly just Bryce Underwood's play this season. And I think that's kind of what you were alluding at with whether or not his potential can be unlocked, because he just wasn't even close to hitting that this past season. Now, Ole Miss at number 20, this is also probably a lot lower than what a lot of people have Ole Miss at, given that they just made the college football playoff semifinals and they have the number two transfer portal class. But very similar to Michigan, here's my problem with Ole Miss. We don't know enough about Deuce Knight. Now, if Trinidad Chambliss gets his waiver and is able to come back, Ole Miss will skyrocket up these rankings. We're going to try and remember to tell you guys where we would put Ole Miss once we get up around that range. Probably somewhere around, at least the top 10, I would say, if they have Trinidad Chambliss back. But without him, I mean, it's just the fact that Deuce Knight is unproven that I can't really put Ole Miss above any of these teams where we know what we're getting out of the quarterback position, because it's really the main thing that we have to go off of right now when trying to rank all of these teams is just the experience that you have at certain key positions, and quarterback is definitely one of those.
I do think, though, for Ole Miss, having Kawan Lacey back next season at running back after a phenomenal season this past year is going to be a huge safety valve if Deuce Knight is their starting quarterback going into next season. But like Jonah said, despite having the number two transfer portal class, it's purely because they have so much to replace. So that's numbers obviously going to be inflated just a little bit. At number 19, we have Virginia, another very quick turnaround for a team that has typically not been super good the past few years. And that was predominantly due to the fact that Chandler Morris, who they got in the transfer portal, was very, very good last year and got them to the ACC championship game, which granted they did end up losing to Duke. But it's going to be a similar story this year because they bring in another very strong transfer portal class. And it's led by the fact that they got Bo Prabula, the starting quarterback from Mizzou last season and previously at Penn State, to be their starting quarterback. They also got Kenny Pickett, not Kenny Pickett, sorry, I'm thinking of Pitt quarterbacks, but Eli Holstein, excuse me, in the transfer portal as well. Although I do anticipate Bo Prabula will be the starting quarterback, despite the fact that he is coming back from an injury. I do think he will be ready to go by the time the fall rolls around. But overall, I do think Virginia has established themselves as a pretty decent team and one that you don't want to mess with, really. And I do think they will have another strong season this year. Maybe not making the ACC title game again, but definitely will be in the mix. And then at number 18, we have Louisville. A little bit of a disappointing season towards the end. They were definitely in the driver's seat and had a decent chance of making the ACC title game if a lot of things went their way, but kind of started to stumble down the stretch, losing a couple close games that they shouldn't have. But Even though they got decimated by the transfer portal and by guys leaving to the NFL draft, they're still going to be very, very good next season, in my opinion. Big addition is after Miller Moss left, their starting quarterback now going to be Lincoln Kienholz from Ohio State. Now, we haven't seen a lot of him. Really, the only evidence we have to go off his play is the Cotton Bowl from a couple of years ago against Mizzou when the Tigers essentially just ran all out blitzes against him and made him uncomfortable. But I think in an actual game plan for him, he can be very solid. Not to mention also getting a lot of solid weapons for him to use in Trey Richardson, LaWayne McCoy, and Brody Foley. And they also were able to get Isaac Brown back on the team after he previously entered the transfer portal. So huge additions offensively. Defensively, maybe there's a couple things to work out. I think the headline that they made in the transfer portal is getting Koan Ettinger. I probably botched that first name a little bit, but safety from Iowa who had a fantastic season. I do think Louisville can make a bit of a run in the ACC, but it ultimately depends if they can avoid having that losing stretch towards the end of the year when it really matters most.
Number 17 is going to be Missouri, and they brought in Austin Simmons from Ole Miss to be their starting quarterback. I actually really like this move. I do think that Austin Simmons, he didn't play great at the start of this year, but Trinidad Chambliss was just incredible this past season. So I think that probably overshadows it a little bit. Austin Simmons is going to be a very solid starting quarterback for Missouri. And then you look at the rest of the team. I mean, they brought in a four-star transfer receiver from Auburn, Horatio Fields, going to be very solid. And just overall, I think with the amount of production that they're returning, that this was a fringe top 25 team by the end of the year. They did lose their bowl game. And I think that Missouri, we haven't really been high on them the past couple years, but they should be a top 25 team next year, in my opinion. Number 16, Arizona. Now, this is another team that I don't think people are necessarily overlooking Arizona, but they might be missing out on some of the potential that this team has. Noah Fafita, I think he's a very, very solid quarterback. And just overall, Arizona, they might not have the best portal class, but they're returning enough production from this season that I do think that the Wildcats are going to have a very, very solid run through the Big 12 next year, and they could potentially be one of the best teams in the conference. They didn't have any major splashes in the transfer portal. They got a tight end, Cole Rusk from Illinois. He was their highest rated player in the class. So just a nice target to add, I guess, for Noah Fafita. The wide receivers should still be solid. They brought in a couple of those, just three-star guys out of the portal, a new offensive line, a couple defensive players. And just, I really do think that the Big 12 is going to be wide open once again next season. We do have one team that's kind of the clear favorite still, but Arizona definitely has the potential to pull off a couple upsets and maybe make a run.
Coming in number 15, we have SMU, a team that kind of started to catch fire towards the end of the last season, and I do think some of that momentum will carry over. Now, they do have a lot of players that are going to be leaving, a lot of starters, but really the big thing that they have returning is starting quarterback Kevin Jennings, who was the whole reason they made the college football playoffs 2 years ago, and it was a big reason why they were in contention for an ACC title towards the end of the year as well. And I do think with some of the additions they've made, they will be fairly decent, picking up a lot of defensive linemen like Marquise White, Ira Singleton as well, and safety Jimmy Wyrick from UTSA. I think defensively is where they will need to make the most additions, considering the offense has usually been pretty explosive the last few years. So I do think SMU has another pretty reasonable chance to make a run in the ACC, maybe make the playoffs. I don't think they're going to be a very dominant team and one that I would expect to compete for a national championship, but I do think that overall this team is still going to be fairly solid and going to give a lot of the other top teams in the ACC some problems.
Number 14 is the Houston Cougars. And I mean, who saw a 10-win season coming from Houston last year? I think Connor and I had talked about maybe predicting them to go 7-5, maybe 8-4 at best, because we were a little bit higher on them than a lot of people, but definitely not at the 10-win range. Great season from Connor Weigman, but Willie Fritz has just really turned this program around. Very impressive job by him, and I do trust him to keep it going, especially bringing back Connor Weigman at quarterback. And just overall, they didn't have a great portal class, but they didn't necessarily need one. So I do think Houston's definitely a team to watch out for here, that should be potentially a as high as a top 15 team like we have them here. Number 13 is USC, and the Trojans are bringing back Jaden Maiava at quarterback. And they have the sixth best portal class in the Big Ten, behind really like the five best teams that you would expect. So, I mean, just overall, it was a solid class. They got three 4 stars, uh, four 3 stars, just mainly filling those few small gaps that they had with just high quality players. So, I do think depth might be a little bit of a concern if they have some injuries because they had a net loss of 13 players in the portal. But with the amount of talent that they have still on this roster, I really do like Jaden Maiava. So I do think USC is a top 15 team heading into next season.
Number 12, we have Oklahoma. Big news for the Sooners is that John Matier will be back as the starting quarterback next season. And I do think that this is really going to help the Sooners because we didn't really get to see everything we expected out of John Matier because he had that injury in his throwing hand in the middle part of the season, which kind of hindered a potential Heisman case if he was able to play in some of the bigger games, including being fully healthy in the Red River rivalry. But overall, the big thing for Oklahoma is the depth they're losing in the front seven. I mean, you can just look at it. R. Mason Thomas is gone, Grayson Halton gone, Marvin Jones Jr. gone, Demonic Williams gone, all in the defensive line, not to mention Kendall Daniels and Sammy Omasigo in the linebacker room as well. But the defense was very good last year, and I anticipate even with the new players they have coming in, the defense will still continue to be very good, led by Cole Sullivan, a transfer linebacker they got from Michigan. And then offensively, I think they're going to be just fine. The offensive line retains a pretty solid core, as well as also welcoming in wide receiver Parker Livingstone from Texas, Trell Harris from Virginia, and welcome back Oklahoma. You have another person from the all-name team, Rocky Beers at tight end coming in from Colorado State. I do think Oklahoma has another solid chance to have similar success that they had last season. I don't remember exactly who they have on their schedule, if it will be as difficult as it was this past year, but they easily could make another run once again. And then at number 11, we have Miami. And now this is going to be another one of those cases like Ole Miss, where this is based off of the fact of what we know at this current moment, which is that Carson Beck is gone. They recently had one of their quarterbacks enter the transfer portal, and they are losing essentially half, if not all, of their offensive line and half of their defense. And granted, they just played a national championship game. They're not really focusing on the transfer portal, but they haven't made a ton of additions through the transfer portal just yet. The big people they're retaining are Mark Fletcher Jr. and the starting running back position, who was phenomenal throughout the playoffs, and then Malachi Tony, who is the best freshman wide receiver this past season. But obviously, the big story that everyone knows right now is that there have been linkage and talks that Duke quarterback Darian Mensah will end up transferring to the U to be their future starting quarterback. But Duke is also pursuing a legal situation, suing Darian Mensah to make him uphold his contract and stay as a Duke Blue Devil. So obviously, we don't really know what's going to happen here. But even with the fact that Darian Mensah might not be on the team, I do still think Miami, after being in the national championship and going on such a dominant run through this playoffs and really actually being back, I do think they're gonna find a quarterback that is going to be good enough to get them to win. I mean, for crying out loud, they got to the national championship game with Carson Beck as their quarterback. I know we hate on them a lot, but like he didn't have like a spectacular season, and that's not the big reason they got there. But the reason we can't get them into our top 10, even if Darian Mensah was their quarterback, is just they're losing so much on their defensive side of the ball that is ultimately what made them such a good team. So we'll just have to see and keep you guys updated with what happens with Miami, who ends up coming in as their starting quarterback, and whatever happens in the transfer portal with some of the key positions that they're losing.
Number 10 is the BYU Cougars. And I mean, this was a very solid team last year. They lost two games, both of them to Texas Tech, and they had some really good wins as well, doing all of that with their true freshman quarterback, Bear Bachmeier. He had a little bit of trouble taking care of the football, 15 touchdowns to 7 interceptions, but really, I do think he's going to be able to get those interception numbers down and hopefully bring those touchdown numbers up this year as well. Just playing as a true freshman at quarterback in college football is incredibly difficult, and I think he really did a phenomenal job leading his team to a top 15 finish. Now heading into next season, he gets his starting running back, LJ Martin, back, as well as his number one wide receiver, Parker Kingston. Kingston was almost a 1,000 yard receiver. LJ Martin had 1,300 yards on the ground. Just overall, this BYU offense is going to be phenomenal next season. The questions are more on the defensive side of the ball. They lost their defensive coordinator, and it's going to be interesting to see how they're able to adapt to that. They did bring in a four-star transfer linebacker as well as a four-star transfer tight end to replace their tight end who left. And I think that they added enough to still have a very solid defense, but if anything holds BYU back next season, I certainly don't think it will be the offense.
And the loss of Jay Hill, their defensive coordinator, is ultimately why we rank them behind a team like LSU, even though LSU is going to be a total anomaly going into next season because obviously Lane Kiffin is the head coach and they're bringing in the best transfer portal class in the country with so many new players. Sam Levitt going to be their starting quarterback. Um, Also bringing in Eugene Wilson, the third wide receiver from Florida, Jace Brown from Kansas State, Winston Watkins from Ole Miss. Essentially, you could argue almost half of Ole Miss's roster is following Lane Kiffin to LSU. And just we know that we thought LSU was going to be pretty good last year, and ultimately that didn't really come to fruition. But I do think LSU has all the right pieces to actually have a pretty good season. Lane Kiffin led Ole Miss essentially to the playoffs last year before leaving, and he's bringing with him his offensive coordinator. So I do anticipate that Sam Levitt is going to be very comfortable in the system that also returns uh, Cade Durham as their starting running back as well. And defensively, that's where some of the issues may lie. But the deciding factor over ranking them ahead of BYU is that their defensive coordinator, even though he hasn't always been the best in his stay there, at least has been with the Tigers since 2024 and has shown improvement over the years. So that's ultimately why we ended up ranking LSU ahead of BYU. And then at number 8, we have Texas A&M. Was one of the best teams in college football for the majority of this season until the very end when they lost to Texas the week before the playoffs began and then lost that really low scoring game 10-3 at College Station against Miami, who then went on to compete in the national championship game. And they are losing a good amount of their team. Biggest losses being Casey Conception, who was Marcel Reed's biggest target, really, as well as a good amount of the offensive line. But defensively, not too much to really be concerned about. There are a couple of key players that they are losing, whether that's to transfer portal or to the NFL draft. But when you retain Marcel Reed and he has one of his better wide receivers from last season also returning in Mario Craver, I do think that they are going to be very, very solid once again. The biggest pickup is that they have solid pass rushers coming in as well. CJ Mims from North Carolina, as well as Anto Saka from Northwestern. Overall, I do think A&M is here to stay. I do think they have broken away from just being stuck at 8-4 year after year, and they will have yet again another solid season.
And you've seen it on the screen this whole time. There's probably already 30 angry comments under this video. Oregon is number 7. And yes, we do know that Dante Moore is returning as the starting quarterback. Is 7 a little bit low? Maybe. But really, Oregon didn't add much in the transfer portal. And that's the main thing we're looking at. They returned a lot of production. Absolutely true. However, when looking at the teams in front of them, I really do feel like a lot of these teams either are just significantly better on one side of the ball. You look at Georgia on the defensive side. When you see our top five, we'll kind of hint at, yeah, or I guess we will be going over, exactly what the strengths are of both of those or all of those teams. Um, their offensive coordinator, Will Stein, leaving is absolutely going to be huge. He's one of the reasons that we have Kentucky ranked at the bottom of our poll. That is how good he was. I think that's going to be a very big loss for the Ducks next season. I'm sure Dan Lanning will make a great hire there, but Dante Moore not having that consistency going into next year is definitely going to be a big factor. And I also just want to throw in there, in my opinion, Dante Moore should have gone to the NFL draft because you'll see it in our top five. I don't think that Dante Moore is the second best quarterback in this next draft class of quarterbacks. There's multiple guys who are quarterbacks for our top five teams who I do believe will be better than Dante Moore this next season. Number 6 is the Georgia Bulldogs. And Georgia, I mean, they're going to be very good next season, returning Gunnar Stockton, always have a good defense. But the biggest thing is they have Kirby Smart. And you just have to trust that he's going to be able to lead this team to success. He's done it every single season. I fully expect the Bulldogs to be back in the playoffs next year and one of the best teams in the SEC. But both of these teams were unable to make our top five because there's a few teams in here that we really like what they have coming back, and especially at the quarterback position. That's the biggest thing really at this point in the season.
I'll also preface this before showing you our top five. The number seven, number six, number five, and number four teams were all very, very close and are super easily interchangeable in my mind. Maybe some teams have a huge edge over the other teams in certain positions, but this is really what we could agree on, what we think might end up happening. We also saw from last year with some returning quarterbacks, things didn't go their way, like with Clemson and LSU. Not necessarily saying that's going to happen again. Dante Moore at Oregon and Gunnar Stockton at Georgia could easily still do very, very well, but maybe we're leaning a little less into some of that experience and looking more at how dominant they were, how good they will fit in a system, which explains why we have Texas Tech at number five. Such a strong rebuild using the transfer portal last year, and they're going to be just as good going into this season as they were last year. They're losing a good amount of their defense, especially their leader in Jacob Rodriguez. But the big story was the addition of Cincinnati quarterback Brendan Sorsby. And Joan and I are very, very high on him. I think he is going to fit very well into this Red Raider style of offense. He's going to be an absolute gunslinger. He is going to have some of the best weapons he's ever had, including the dynamic rushing attack that Texas Tech had last season with both Cameron Dickey and Jacoby Williams both returning. They have a good amount of receivers also joining the program. Kenny Johnson from Pitt, Dante Lee Jr. from Liberty, and Malcolm Simmons from Auburn. I just think that Texas Tech, with such a strong rebuild from last season, is here to stay. And I think with Brendan Sorsby at the helm, the offense might actually be able to score some points if they are in the college football playoffs instead of getting blanketed by Oregon like they did this past year. So Red Raiders come in at number five for us.
Number 4 is going to be Notre Dame. And the Fighting Irish, while they did opt out of their bowl game last year, a lot of people lost respect for them from that. They're going to be a really good team next season. And I do think there's definitely an argument to be made that they were a top 10 team this season. It really just comes down to the fact that they didn't beat Miami head to head. And it certainly looks like the committee made the right decision because of how far Miami went. but I believe this was a very, very good Notre Dame team this past season. They were ended the season on a 10-game win streak. Just overall, I think that they're going to have a really, really solid offense coming into next year. CJ Carr, I really like him at the quarterback position. He's actually one of the Heisman favorites already after starting last year as a freshman. Running back is definitely a question mark. They lost Jadarian Price and Jeremiah Love to the NFL draft. However, wide receiver is looking really good. They returned Jaden Greathouse and Jordan Faison, as well as bringing in two Ohio State former five stars, Quincy Porter and Mylan Graham. The offensive line should still be solid. Cooper Flanagan at tight end. Just overall, I think the offense is going to be really good. Defensively, I do still think Notre Dame is going to have a good enough defense to keep them in the top five, but with how good CJ Carr in this offense is going to be, it doesn't have to be a perfect defense. And when you look at their schedule, it's going to be really easy. I think BYU is their toughest game. If they can get through that, the Fighting Irish will very likely be 12-0 at the end of next season. Number three is the Ohio State Buckeyes. The Buckeyes are returning Julian Sayin at quarterback, who had really a phenomenal freshman season. And I know he didn't play necessarily great in that final game against Miami, but the offensive line was getting blown up. There were injuries there. And just overall, I don't really blame that loss necessarily on him. I think Ohio State, just in general, kind of played bad that game. And overall, the rest of the team, the defense is definitely losing a lot of starters, but they retained Matt Patricia, who turned this into the number one defense in the country. And they brought in a lot of really good transfers, multiple all ACC safeties. On the offensive side, the whole offensive line, except for one starter, is coming back. At wide receiver, you still have Jeremiah Smith, which is absolutely huge. Getting Chris Henry Jr. in the just the incoming freshman class. Your running backs are coming back and Bo Jackson. So just overall, I think Ohio State is going to have a very good season next year. They have, in my opinion, they filled their needs in the transfer portal the best out of any of these teams. So there really is an argument to be made for Ohio State to be, either one or two potentially. I think kind of similar to four through seven. One through three here are very, very closely grouped. There were just a few small things that led us to rank the teams as we did.
And I think the primary thing for these two teams that we ranked ahead of Ohio State is some continuity on the coaching staff. Even though with Texas at number two, Steve Sarkisian did fire their defensive coordinator and brought in Texas's former coach in waiting in Will Muschamp to be their defensive coordinator now. But overall, the team still is pretty much intact in Indiana after just winning a national championship. Retains most of its coaching staff as well. But starting with Texas, they hit the portal hard. It might not be some of like the biggest classes you will see them bringing in, but who they have coming to join this team that was really hitting their stride towards the end of last year, especially with Arch Manning, they're going to be scary going into next season. They got the number one receiver in the portal to join them in Cam Coleman out of Auburn. They added both Hollywood Smothers and Raleek Brown from NC State as their running backs, and Rasheem Biles, linebacker out of Pittsburgh. This team is just going to be on another level going into next season. I think after all the hype has died down a little bit for Arch Manning and now he can kind of relax and really just play his game, Texas is going to be the team to beat despite who they have lost, including Michael Taft and Anthony Hill Jr. on the defense, Malik Muhammad, contributing Weiser in the backfield. But they've addressed all those positions, not to mention Ryan Wingo is also back at the wide receiver position. So that dynamic duo of Coleman and Wingo is going to be absolutely disgusting to play against. Good luck to all of those defenses trying to stop them. But at number one, we do have the national champions, the Indiana Hoosiers. Just an unbelievable turnaround for this program. Curt Cignetti has worked wonders for the Hoosiers, and it doesn't just happen on the field. with winning a national championship with this team that did not have like all the 5 stars that a bunch of these other teams have. He has also done a phenomenal job in the portal considering who he has leading. His Heisman winning quarterback in Fernando Mendoza is going to be the #1 draft pick in the NFL. Elijah Sherrod's gone. Pat Coogan, their center, is gone. Aiden Fisher, their lead linebacker, is also gone. And a lot of guys also still have decisions to make, like D'Angelo Pons and Omar Cooper Jr. and Carter Smith, their left tackle. If they go to the NFL, then maybe this gets a little bit hairier. But who they've added in the portal has been ridiculous. They have their next starting quarterback in Josh Hoover, who Jordan and I have been saying for the past year is a absolute stud from TCU, and I think he's going to fit in perfectly in this Indiana offense. Nick Marsh from Michigan State, who I think was held back a little bit by the team's play, but he was phenomenal in his freshman year. And I think with Josh Hoover as his quarterback, he's going to be insane. Turbo Richard coming in as their running back from Boston College, bumping up the defensive line with Toby Osun Sasami or something like that. I apologize, but he's coming in from Kansas State. Preston Zachman with safety from Wisconsin. It's just, I don't understand how Indiana has done it in just a couple years to become such a powerhouse and be such a popular destination for some of the best players in the country. I do think also with both their starting running backs returning as well, since they use both of them, it's going to be it's going to be Indiana at the top once again for us. And I really don't see anyone taking their place until we actually see a game played in the fall. But until then, that is our top 25. Way too early for the 2026 seasons. Please make sure to comment and tell us your opinions. Tell us how wrong we are. Tell us a team you think might actually have a chance to make a little bit of a run that we maybe didn't think just missed out on our top 25. But until then, thank you guys for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any more of our content. We will be getting into more of our expectations for each of these teams going into next season in the coming weeks. But until then, thank you guys, and we will see you next time.